What are academic and Pyrrhonic skepticism?
In the Renaissance and early modern revival of ancient Greek ideas, academic skepticism was the position that no knowledge is possible, whereas Pyrrhonic skepticism was the position that we do not have enough evidence to know whether any knowledge is possible. The conclusion of Pyrrhonic skepticism is that all judgment on all questions about knowledge should be suspended.
Why were Locke's views on religion influential?
Locke held a common-sense view of religion and advised toleration of competing sects within Protestantism. His toleration did not extend to Catholicism, however. Although that did not diminish its force within the Protestant community. In The Reasonableness of Christianity, 1695, he allowed for the validity of revelation, but only insofar as it did not violate previously accepted facts or beliefs. He suggested that the Church of England could be reformed to attract dissenters by diminishing the power of its bishops, eliminating all mysteries, rituals, and superstitions in belief, and reducing its creed to simply an acknowledgement of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. In his letter on toleration, 1689, Locke argued against religious persecution of all kinds or any laws that interfered with those religious practices that would be lawful if they were not specifically religious. Part of his argument was the pragmatic one that suppression of religious beliefs unnecessarily breeds rebellion. His overall endorsement of toleration, particularly on the part of government, was to have a later influence on the separation between church and state in the U.S. Constitution.
How did Augustine support the theology of the Church with philosophy?
St. Augustine, 354–430, tried to justify the whole of human knowledge, even though he also allowed for error. All knowledge, according to Augustine, resided within the soul as a substance endowed with reason and fitted to rule a body. While the soul can act on the body cannot act on the soul. God is always present to the soul, whether the soul is aware of his light or turns away from it. These views of Augustine established the superiority of religion to philosophy and also embedded God in the same human faculty associated with non-religious understanding to the elevation of religious understanding. Augustine's greatest work was The City of God, in which he separated the temporal state, government on earth, from the religious realm of the afterlife. The temporal state was to have a secondary role in ensuring peace, order, safety, and physical well-being for its citizens. The heavenly city, by contrast, requires living according to God's rules. Although the temporal and heavenly cities may at times overlap, only God's city is eternal.
What was Hume's problem of induction?
Hume introduced an enormous problem with how we reason from past or present to the future that still plagues philosophers of science and epistemologists today. He pointed out that no matter how comprehensive our past experience, it is never a logical contradiction to deny that the same thing which happened in the past will happen in the future. Take the idea that the sun will rise tomorrow. Although we have always known it to rise every day, it is not a contradiction to say it won't rise tomorrow. If one objects that past experience gives us regularities between events, like those that occur today and the sun rising thereafter, Hume's response would be that we do not know that those regularities will occur in the future. To take another example, oxygen, friction, and combustible material have always resulted in fire. But maybe in the future that very combination will not be followed by fire. Hume's problem of induction goes beyond saying that we never know enough to predict the future. His claim is that even when we do know enough to predict the future, where that knowledge has been proven in past experience, we do not know that the patterns of our experience in the future will resemble the patterns of the past. Of course, he did not disregard probability or prudence. His attack was on the notion that we can be certain about the future.
Why did Søren Kierkegaard believe Friedrich Hegel did not write to him?
First of all, Kierkegaard did not take seriously Friedrich Hegel's 1770 to 1831 claim to have written the system of everything. Kierkegaard thought that everything could be viewed as a system by God, but that no human thinker, who is himself incomplete, could have such a perspective. He also rejected the tradition on which Hegel built that posits intellectual doubt as the beginning of philosophy. Kierkegaard thought that the beginning of philosophy was wonder. Also, he didn't think that real doubt could be solved intellectually, but that it required an act of will. Finally, Kierkegaard did not think that God or the Absolute could be immanent in the world, because God is instead the ultimate other, defying rational understanding. Kierkegaard's biggest complaint about Hegel was that he was like a man who had built a palace but lived outside it in a miserable hovel. He meant by this that in constructing his grand and elaborate system, Hegel had neglected his own immediate existence as a concrete individual.
How did John Searle disagree with Alan Matheson Turing?
The American philosopher John Searle, 1932, a professor at the University of California at Berkeley since 1959, has described his own work as an attempt to reconcile the world of science with the human self-conception of mindful animals with free will. In his Intentionality, an essay on the philosophy of mind, 1983. Searle argued that mental states are both caused by and realized in neurobiological brain processes. He called this view biological naturalism. In his Chinese room argument, he attempted to refute a broad Turing-inspired strong artificial intelligence view that mind could be duplicated by the right computational device. Additional works by Searle, which advocate the non-reductionality of consciousness, while also acknowledging contemporary science, are Expression and Meaning, Studies in the Theory of Speech Acts, 1979. The Rediscovery of the Mind, 1992, The Mystery of Consciousness, 1997, and Mind, A Brief Introduction, 2004.
Who was Søren Kierkegaard?
Søren Abe Kierkegaard, 1813–1855, was a Danish Christian existentialist who extolled religious faith as an individual and emotional leap from all that was reasonable and rational. He wrote from his heart and the emotional circumstances of his own life.
Who was Jacques Lacan?
Jacques Lacan, 1901–1981, was a psychoanalyst who was barred from the International Psychoanalytic Association for his ideas, which nonetheless were very influential. His main works are Écrits, Writings, 1966, The Language of the Self, 1978, and his published seminars. Lacan applied a Saussurean notion of the linguistic order to Freudian psychology. He thought that metaphor and metonymy, substitution of an attribute of a thing for a thing itself, were the main unconscious mechanisms, and that psychotherapy literally works as a form of speech that corrects speech by reinserting into discourse what has been obscured from it by neurosis. Lacan is famous for his claim that the ego consists merely of identifications made imaginatively. He meant that human beings imagine themselves as having certain characteristics at an early age, and that is how the self develops. Speech creates social connection. But language is a formal system in which words derive meanings from other words only.
Who was Friedrich Schelling?
The literary and artistic romantics of his era deeply influenced the philosophy of Arthur Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, 1776–1854. He studied at Tübinger Stift, the seminary of the Protestant Church in Württemberg, and graduated from the philosophy faculty there in 1792. He then attended lectures at the University of Leipzig while working as a tutor to aristocratic youth. At the age of 23 he received an unprecedented offer to teach philosophy at the University of Jena. He subsequently held chairs at the universities at Würzburg, Erlangen, Munich, and finally Berlin, where he was expected to oppose the Hegelians. His primary motivation in philosophy appears to have been aesthetic, and he became known for his nature philosophy, as developed in his system of transcendental idealism, 1800.
What was the Sidgwick's interest in the paranormal?
Henry Sidgwick helped found the Society for Psychical Research in 1892, and his wife, Eleanor, was an active participant. The Sidgwicks believed that the work of society could help confirm religious claims, such as life after death. They believed that an afterlife was necessary as a motivation for morality in this life. However, their investigations were inconclusive. Even though Eleanor believed that Henry communicated with her after his death in 1900.
Who was Karl Marx?
Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, was the German revolutionary and philosopher of modern society and economics who is most often credited with having founded communism and socialism as political movements and systems of thought. He is also credited with the impetus behind the modern labor union movement. Marx's early works are considered utopian and were not published in his lifetime. His magnum opus is Das Kapital, Capital, released in 1867, 1885, and 1894. Although the Communist Manifesto, 1848, that he wrote with Friedrich Engels, 1820 to 1895, is less hypothetical and more accessible to the reader. At the time Marx and Engels wrote, the following did not exist for workers in industrialized nations: minimum wage laws, healthcare insurance, pension plans, workplace safety regulations, laws against child labor, or specified hours for shifts or work weeks. Neither was there widespread and compulsory public education for the children of workers. While some of these goods do not universally exist at this time in industrialized nations and may not exist at all in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America, they are now generally taken for granted as fundamental human entitlements.
What are some other interesting facts about A. J. Ayer's life and career?
Ayer was a prominent subject of academic gossip for his womanizing. He was married 4 times, and for his engagement in fashionable popular culture. There was an overall glamour to his life. Ayer's mother's family founded the French Citroën car company, and his father worked for the wealthy Rothschild family of bankers. He attended Eton, won a scholarship to Oxford, and served in the Special Operations Executive, during World War II. Before the war, while on a visit to New York, Air made a record with actress Lauren Bacall. He supported the Tottenham Hotspur Football Club and was known to its fans as the Prof. Air was also a secular humanist. He was honorary associate of the Rationalist Press Association after 1947. And a successor to evolutionary biologist and humanist Julian Huxley when he became president of the British Humanist Association. In 1965, Ayer was named the first president of the Agnostics Adoption Society. He edited the anthology The Humanist Outlook in 1965. At the peak of his career, Ayer served as a sort of in-house atheist for the British Broadcasting Corporation. He debated the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, 1907 to 1994, on the subject of religion. Copleston was the author of the 9-volume History of Philosophy. 1946 to 1975, so the two were matched in erudition. Ayer, apparently briefly, revised his lifelong atheism after a near death experience in 1989 brought on by choking on a piece of smoked salmon. Toward the end of his life, though, he said, "What I should have said is that my experiences have weakened. Not my belief that there is no life after death, but my inflexible attitude towards that belief."
What was Friedrich Schelling's major thesis?
Schelling believed that the entirety of nature, physical as well as mental, was mind on the way toward consciousness. But consciousness, or the human self, is the creator of nature. Life cannot be explained in mechanistic or inert terms. Schelling resurrected a type of alchemical thought whereby magnetism, which is the general form of particular existence, either becomes evident in light or maleness, or else becomes evident in heavy inertia, or femaleness. In ordinary language, although there was nothing ordinary about this belief, the alchemists believed that things that exist are all made up of a magnetic something that can manifest itself in either lightweight and airy, or male, beings, or else in heavy and dense, or female, beings. He believed that existent reality became separated from the absolute in a spontaneous act of freedom, which created time itself, along with the world as we know it. That is, there occurred in the absolute a spontaneous burst of freedom that resulted in the separation of what we perceive as reality from the absolute. Another consequence was the appearance of time. This is to say that the absolute exists outside of time. Schelling had a following among romantics in the sciences, as well as in the arts, because romantics in the 19th century, as today, loved quasi-mystical explanations of the world. Lawrence Ockham, 1774–1851, for example, postulated that all of life in Schelling's sense, in which nature is unconscious mind, originated in primeval slime. The connection between Ockham's idea and Schelling's thought is not at all clear, except to indicate how one wild set of ideas is capable of inspiring others.
What were Rousseau's most influential ideas?
Rousseau proclaimed and argued for the natural goodness of man. It was society and custom that created human vice and evils in the world, he felt. For example, in the natural state, primitive man had a form of wholesome self-love, or amour de soi, which in society became amour propre, or pride and vanity about how he was regarded by others. In the natural condition, man is born free, but in society, the institution of private property, which Rousseau considered a form of theft, as well as other corrupt institutions, resulted in man being everywhere in chains. Rousseau posited a natural sympathy in human relations, which had been corrupted by greed, and a simple piety, which was distorted by organized religion. This vision of the goodness of man was set forth in Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. 1750, and in his novels. In Of the Social Contract, Principles of Political Right, 1762. Rousseau addressed the same questions treated by Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704, of how, given original freedom, a good government can be imagined to come about, and what such a government would be like. Rousseau postulated that individual rights are given up to the community in the founding contract. In return, the individual becomes a citizen whose rights are protected. But this is an active model of citizenship because the individual is required to agree to the general will at the same time that he or she acts in self-interest.
Who was Avicenna?
Avicenna, 980-1037, was a Persian physician and commentator on Aristotle. He was born near Bokhara, which was then the capital of the Samanid dynasty, located in present-day Uzbekistan. By the age of 10, he had mastery of the Quran and Arabic grammar and literature. By 16, he was highly knowledgeable about natural science, metaphysics, and theories of medicine. He also treated the sick and helped the Samanid prince Nut ibn Mansur, 976 to 997. His reward for that was access to the prince's library. Avicenna became an expert on the writings of Aristotle, wrote extensive commentaries, and also produced many treatises of his own on science, religion, and philosophy. His medical encyclopedia, Al-Shifa, The Healing, was based on Aristotle's work, and his Al-Qanun fi Tibb, the Canon of Medicine, written when he was 21, became famous throughout the Middle East and Europe. As an Aristotelian interpreter, he was well known for claiming that the universality of our ideas is a product of the mind. He was not a complete nominalist about universals, however, because he thought that there were differences and similarities among things of the same kind, which existed independently of thought. The products of thought were the formal qualities of things. This doctrine, known as intellectus informis agit universalitatem, neatly corresponded with Aristotle's claim that scientific knowledge consisted in truths about forms or essences. However, although Avicenna's interpretation of Aristotle seemed to be rather staid and unoriginal, his claim that it could be reconciled with Islam was soon challenged by Al-Ghazali, 1058–1111. And in the generation after that it was radically revised, along with Al-Ghazali's objections, by Averroes, c. 1126 c. 1198.
How was A. J. Eyre a phenomenalist?
According to Eyre, meaningful factual statements can be reduced to claims about sense data. While he seemed at times to temper this view, over his career he stuck to sense data as the foundation of empirical knowledge. In a famous exchange with the ordinary language philosopher J. L. Austin, 1911–1960, Eyre defended his theory of sense data. Eyre's position was that sense data are not directly intuited until they have led to a perception of the ordinary world, with all of its normally perceptible objects, such as tables and chairs. Austin, who was a colleague of Eyre's at Cambridge, held that Eyre's theory of sense data could not be a form of foundationism because it presupposed common sense reality. That is, Austin's claim against Eyre was that, contrary to how Eyre seemed to present his case, perceptual knowledge was not built up of sense data. Eyre defended his view by claiming that in the process of verification sense data were necessary to confirm perceptions.
What are some key events for which Socrates is often remembered?
Although Plato imports the character of Socrates into almost all of his dialogues, the early dialogues are considered to present a more accurate picture of the historical Socrates, who left no writings of his own. At one time, Socrates studied natural philosophy with Archelaus, who was a pupil of Anaxagoras, c. 500–428 BCE. But by the time he took up philosophy in earnest, Socrates' main interests were in ethics. Unlike many Athenians, he claimed not to understand how ethics derived from religion. In Plato's Euthyphro, Socrates encounters the eponymous priest on the way to his own trial and asks him what piety is. Euthyphro responds that piety is what the gods love. Socrates asks him if piety is good because the gods love it, or if the gods love it because it is good. If something is good because the gods love it, then we need to know which gods to follow, because the gods often disagree. But if the gods love something because it is already good, then there must be a standard of goodness, or in this case, piety, which is separate from the gods. That means that the gods are not in themselves the source of morality. Euthyphro, of course, has no answer to this dilemma, and scurries away from Socrates. In the Apology, Socrates taunts and baits the young prosecutor Meletus. In a display of dialectic that is exactly what he is on trial for. He relates how he began talking to the experts in the arts and government to seek wisdom, but found that apart from their high birth, wealth, or respected positions, these experts knew less than he. Socrates swears that he has always served Athens, first as a soldier and then as a citizen concerned for the virtue of its youth. He avows his own belief in the approved gods and denies that he ever tried to introduce new gods. The jury of 450 convict him with a majority of 30. Socrates has the right to make an alternative proposal to the death sentence. Voluntary exile would be an appropriate alternative, but instead Socrates suggests that he be given free meals in the Prytaneum for the rest of his life, in place of some charioteer. The charioteers were champion chariot drivers who had high status as popular heroes, as well as athletes. The charioteers, Socrates says, only make people feel good, while he directly attends to their well-being. He also proposes first a fine of 1 mina, and then, at the insistence of his friends, 30 minae, still an absurdly small sum against a sentence of death. The court is not moved by Socrates' counter-proposal and the death sentence stands. In the introduction to Plato's Republic, Socrates sets up the purpose of this utopian work. By talking to a group of friends about the nature of justice. Here, Thrasymachus says that justice is whatever serves those in power. Socrates follows with a description of the psychology of a just person. But this does not answer the question of what justice itself is. Socrates then suggests that justice in individuals is difficult to define, but that insofar as the state is the individual writ large, it might be easier to understand what makes a state just and answer the question in that way. The Republic proper is Plato's description of a just state.
What stories did Hobbes' contemporaries tell about him?
According to the biography of Hobbes written by his contemporary John Aubrey, when Hobbes was at Oxford, he used to get up early in the morning and venture forth with lead weights, pack threads, and parings of cheese. He would smear the threads with bird lime, an adhesive substance used to trap birds by sticking their feet to something, and bait them with the cheese. Jackdaws would spy them from far away and strike at the bait. Young Hobbes would then haul in the string and the weights would cling to the bird's wings. Aubrey does not furnish details about what happened after that. After the plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666, people sought reasons for God's wrath. Parliament passed a bill to suppress atheism, and a committee was constituted to investigate Hobbes' Leviathan. There was a report that Hobbes had been burned in effigy, and Hobbes was afraid that his papers would be searched, so he himself burned part of them. The king, who liked Hobbes, intervened, but from then on Hobbes was not permitted to publish his work. Neither the Roman Catholic Church nor Oxford University permitted his books to be read. And they occasionally even burned them.
What were the main philosophical aspects of the scientific revolution?
From a purely philosophical perspective, given the strong influence of Neoplatonic thought in the work of almost all the natural philosophers, beginning with key Italian Renaissance thinkers, moving through Copernicus, and possibly culminating in Newton. The scientific revolution can be viewed as a sustained revolt against Aristotelianism back toward Platonism. But it is more complicated than that. Aristotelianism was directly associated with the power of the Catholic Church, which diminished as much for political and doctrinal reasons during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation as it did in philosophical circles. And, as it turned out, historically within both science and the philosophy of science. The revived influence of Neoplatonic metaphysics was relatively short-lived. By the Age of Reason, or the 18th century Enlightenment, an empirically based rationality and secular reason came to form the educated worldview in the West.
Who were the important philosophers of Middle Stoicism?
Middle Stoicism matured in Rhodes, with Painetius, c. 185 to 110 BCE, and Posidonius, c. 125 to 50 BCE. Both of whom influenced the statesman and writer Cicero, 106 to 43 BCE. Posidonius, c. 125 to 50 BCE. Incorporated both Platonic and Aristotelian ideas into his views. The main accomplishment of Middle Stoicism was to apply Greek ideas to military and political life in Roman culture. Middle Stoicism was generally more focused on how those who were Stoics could weather specific life problems, such as defeat in war, or imprisonment.
What was Immanuel Kant's notion of synthetic a priori knowledge?
Knowledge is synthetic or ampliative, according to Kant. If it is about objects that can be experienced in the world, it is a priori if it can be known without experience.
Why did philosophers love Maimonides?
Maimonides, 1135 to 1204, provided a justification for philosophical thought in a religious context at a time when philosophers feared persecution from religious authorities. The problems Maimonides raised in reconciling Aristotelian philosophy or the best conclusions of reason at that time with religion brought into religion itself philosophical problems about the limits of knowledge and what ought to be concluded when reason has run out.
Have some philosophers criticized consequentialism?
Elizabeth Anscombe, 1910–2001, in a 1958 article, Modern Moral Philosophy, coined the term consequentialism when she criticized 20th-century versions of utilitarianism that did not distinguish between intended and unintended consequences. Anscombe argued that only intended consequences have moral value. Anscombe is also famous for her defense of Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225–1274, Doctrine of Double Effect, DDE. According to DDE, an action is morally permissible if it has known bad consequences, but it is not the intention or goal of the person performing the action to bring about those consequences. In Jesuit moral reasoning about performing craniotomies, operations to crush a baby's skull so that the baby can be extracted to save its mother's life, DDE has been used. If it is not the obstetrician's goal to kill the baby but merely to extract it, craniotomies are deemed permissible. Anscombe provided this example: say she meets her mortal enemy on a cliff. If her enemy falls off because she accidentally falls against him, she is blameless, even though the unintended effect of the enemy's death is welcome to her, after the fact. Others have criticized the ways in which consequentialism seems to ignore issues of justice in cases where an unjust act or even a human sacrifice might serve to maximize benefits for others.
What was social Darwinism?
Social Darwinism was an application of the Darwinian idea of the survival of the fittest to inequalities and opportunities in contemporary 19th-century society. It was an age in which the enterprising could amass large fortunes in a short period of time, although they had to compete with other capitalists. And those who labored, often in unhealthy and exhausting conditions for barely enough pay to support themselves, also competed among themselves for available jobs. Social Darwinists wrote popular books, sometimes consisting of what today would be considered racist or class-based eugenics. And their claims made a strong impression on general readers. They shared a belief that competition was valuable in itself and that those who failed in life's contests failed a deeper test of evolutionary survival. Instead of social reform, their ideals were to encourage the traits that enabled success at competition by means of selective human breeding, as well as moral approval of the winners.
How did Isaiah Berlin oppose Marxist historicism?
Berlin did not think that impersonal or absolute forces could determine history. apart from the free will of exceptional individuals.
Who was Alfred North Whitehead?
Alfred North Whitehead, 1861–1947, was famous in analytic philosophy for his collaboration with his student Bertrand Russell. 1872–1970, on Principia Mathematica, 3 volumes, 1910, 1912, 1913. Principia took almost 10 years to complete and was highly regarded as an impressive but ultimately unsuccessful attempt to reduce mathematics to logic. Whitehead was also the American originator of process philosophy, a version of philosophy of science and metaphysics that is similar to pragmatism in its emphasis on change and the dynamic nature of experience.
What was Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of a gay science?
In a series of aphorisms, Nietzsche advocates philosophy as a celebration of life. In contrast to the stultified and stultifying practices of the German intellectuals, whom he had criticized as Philistines throughout his writings during the 1870s. He caps his scientific ideals with the cosmological and possibly Neoplatonistic doctrine of life as a cycle, which he calls the eternal recurrence. Everyone's life recurs an endless number of times, and the test of a life worth living is that every moment one can will the infinite return of that moment in some future life, and do so with joy. Nietzsche applauded the ideal of the most high-spirited, alive, and world-affirming human being who has not only come to terms and learned to get along with whatever was and is, but who wants to have what was and is repeated into all eternity. And although he thought that we eternally recur, built into what happens again and again is continuous choice, in a chance spectacle of endless opportunity. In form, this perspective is a reenactment by Nietzsche of the birth of tragedy, with the forces of high spirit and reason affirming the worst that has, can, and will happen.
That is, should we say that the limits of reason are the limits of human knowledge? Or should we extend the limits of reason into the domain of religious faith and revelation?
Strictly speaking, these are questions of how we ought to think about religion. In the Middle Ages, which was the great age of religion, philosophers were constrained to begin their philosophizing with basic assumptions that God existed and that he was good. But philosophers have always been motivated to push through to the limits of knowledge and seek certainty within those limits. By deploying Aristotle as the personification of philosophy, Maimonides was able to raise necessarily covered questions of whether reason could justify belief in the existence and teachings not only of the Judaic version of God, but also of the Christian, and perhaps Muslim, God. We should remember that such questions, had they not been posed under the cover of the august and unquestionable authority of the philosopher himself, namely, Aristotle, would have resulted in loss of livelihood, excommunication, banishment or ostracism from the community of the devout and faithful, and also death itself. Philosophers were not stupid in the great age of religion. Notwithstanding their apparent devotion to varied theological regimes and their leaders, who, it just so happened, controlled all aspects of social, political, and economic life in Europe and the Middle East. At the same time that they upheld specific religious doctrines.
What religious issues are involved in environmental thought, pro and con?
Some of the critical perspective derives from a Christian view embedded in Western political philosophy that God gave the earth and everything on it to humankind to rule over for our use. Only humans have the spark of divinity that justifies intrinsic value. Nonetheless, many religious groups have proclaimed an obligation of benevolent stewardship over parts of the earth.
What were Arthur Schopenhauer's main ideas?
Schopenhauer offered an original interpretation of Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 metaphysics based on additional inspiration. He wrote, "I owe what is best in my own development to the impression made by Kant's works. The sacred writings of the Hindus, and Plato." In his dissertation, he argued that Kant's phenomenal world, or the world of our experience, which Schopenhauer called the world of representation, obeys the principle of sufficient reason. Which he stated this way: every possible object stands in a necessary relation to other objects. On the one hand as determined, on the other as determining. That is, everything is both a cause and an effect, and these relations are necessary. Which is to say that they cannot be denied without logical contradiction. Kant's noumenal world, or the things in themselves, of which we can know nothing except that they exist, became knowable, according to Schopenhauer, through our inner reality, which is our will. Again following Kant, because mathematics or numbers are projections of the mind that enable us to experience phenomena. Schopenhauer felt that the noumenal world has no number, it is one. This claim would have no consequences in experience if it were true, since it is an effort to describe what underlies experience.
Who was Friedrich Engels?
Friedrich Engels, 1820–1895, founded Marxism with Karl Marx, 1818–1883. In addition to the Communist Manifesto, 1848. They collaborated on the Holy Family, 1844, and the German Ideology, 1845. Engels, The Condition of the Working Class in England, 1844. Described the suffering in the lives of workers at that time. Engels also published Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, 1880, and Anti-Düring, 1878. In the Dialectics of Nature, 1883, Engels related historical materialism to natural science and claimed that there were universal laws of nature and thought. Engels' greatest contribution was a presentation of Marx's ideas in more accessible and popular formats and terms. Engels' father was a textile manufacturer, and the young Engels worked at his mill in Manchester, eventually owning it. Engels helped Marx financially throughout his life and also supported his children after Marx died. He edited Marx's Das Kapital after Marx's death.
What is the difference between a moral system and a moral theory?
A moral system specifies principles according to which people should act, such as deontological or duty ethics, utilitarianism, or virtue ethics. A moral theory is an account of basic moral terms such as good or evil and the nature of moral judgments and arguments. Moral theorists may also compare different moral systems.
What was unusual about Vico's autobiography?
Vico told the story of his life, Life of Giambattista Vico, written by himself. 1725 to 1728, in the third person, and he analyzed both the effect of his circumstances on his temperament and how his ideas developed before he began writing. His autobiography is thus his intellectual history. Here is how it begins: Signor Giambattista Vico. He was born in Naples in the year 1670 of upright parents, who left behind them a very good reputation. The father was of cheerful humor, the mother of a quite melancholy temper, and both came together in the fair disposition of this little son of theirs. As a boy he was very lively and restless, but at the age of 7 he fell headfirst from high on a ladder to the floor, and remained a good 5 hours motionless and senseless, fracturing the right side of the cranium without breaking the skin. Hence from the fracture arose a shapeless tumor, and from the many deep lancings of it the child lost a great deal of blood, such that the surgeon, having observed the broken cranium and considering the long state of unconsciousness, made the prediction that he would either die of it or he would survive stolid. However, neither of the two parts of this judgment, by the grace of God, came true. But as a result of this illness and recovery he grew up, from then on, with a melancholy and acrid nature which necessarily belongs to ingenious and profound men, who through ingenuity flash like lightning in acuity, through reflection take no pleasure in witticism and falsity.
What were Friedrich Hegel's main ideas?
Hegel's system is difficult to describe because all of its parts are interrelated. And so to describe one aspect of it is to evoke all of the others. It is not clear exactly where an interpreter might begin. Hegel's order of exposition in the progression of his work is not a good guide because the structure of his system has to be presupposed in order to make sense of the progression. In other words, Hegel had his whole system in mind as he wrote about different parts of it. This said, there are several important elements that can be identified as Hegel's premises. Man has a history, but nature does not. All men do not have the same categories of fact. Human thought develops. Philosophy should give a rational account of religion. Social stability is possible after the French Revolution. Individual autonomy is possible in a unified society. The nature of things is a system, and a system of knowledge must reflect that.
What is fideism and what does it have to do with what Montaigne demonstrated about skepticism?
Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, demonstrated how skepticism could be a double-edged sword. It could be used to reject irrational claims, and it could be used to attack the certainty of any body of knowledge, including scientific knowledge based on the senses and the conclusions of logical reasoning. This made skepticism extremely useful for Catholic theologians attacking the claims of Protestants, and vice versa. Today, we think of skeptics as those who require careful scientific evidence for claims and judgments. Usually a skeptic is someone who will not take anything on faith. But Montaigne showed that even the best evidence, including sensory information, can be doubted, so that for him, the skeptic is someone who is better off relying on faith. What Montaigne had in mind was not only faith about knowledge that could not be proved to a certainty, but a life of faith in which all attempts at rigorous knowledge were avoided. This is known as fideism.
What did Plato mean by the divided line?
What Plato meant by the divided line is explained by Socrates in the Republic. Now take a line which has been cut into two unequal parts and divide each of them again in the same proportion. And suppose the two main divisions to answer, one to the visible and the other to the intelligible. And then compare the subdivisions in respect of their clearness and want of clearness. And you will find that the first section in the sphere of the visible consists of images.
Was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon a friend of Karl Marx?
Very briefly.
How was John Duns Scotus' work different from Thomas Aquinas?
John Duns Scotus, 1266–1308, was not opposed to Aquinas, 1224–1274, but he brought St. Augustine's, 354–430, thought into philosophical and theological conversations that were largely dominated by interest in Aristotle. Duns Scotus also drew on Avicenna's, c. 980–1037, notion of unified being in his idea of God as infinite being, who had appeared to Moses as I am who am. Duns Scotus lectured at Oxford, Paris, and Cologne, where he taught that God had created each individual being with a unique nature or hekiity. Duns Scotus thought it was the will and not the intellect that is rational, because the will can will either one thing or its opposite. The will has both an intellectual appetite for happiness and self-actualization and a desire to love things based on their inherent value. These aspects of the will incline us to love God for our own good and also because He is God. Duns Scotus introduced a new idea of intellectual intuition, a kind of awareness that enables us to be certain of our own thoughts, and in the afterlife, be in the direct presence of God.
What did Ludwig Wittgenstein accomplish in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus?
Although the work is considered one of the greatest achievements in philosophy, it's really not clear. Wittgenstein's stated intention was to address the problems of philosophy that had preoccupied Gottlob Frege. 1848–1925, and Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, Arthur Schopenhauer. 1788–1860, was another influence on the work, although he said at the end of this work, "My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way: anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical." At the beginning of the book, Wittgenstein claims that his main purpose is ethical. The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus consists of 7 sets of numbered propositions or statements, which are believed to be about the connection between language and the world. It seems to present an account of the essence of language as expressive of thought. Thought, according to Wittgenstein, is limited to what is factual, so that the propositions of language are representations of the world. The propositions of logic, on the other hand, convey no factual information. Logic consists of tautologies. Logic is very useful, but all of its conclusions are true by definition. Wittgenstein believed that a meaningful sentence must have a precise structure that is made up of simple, in Russell's language, atomic, sentences or simple names. Atomic sentences are pictures of states of affairs. Working backwards from this picture theory of meaning, it would follow that, given the ideal logical language, the world itself has a logical structure. Wittgenstein was to later abandon this view in favor of philosophical activity that consisted of descriptive analysis of ordinary language. But before he did that, the Tractatus had enormous influence on the New 20th century school of thought known as logical positivism.
What was Locke's solution to the Cartesian mind-body problem?
Locke held that all of our knowledge comes to us from our ideas and that we do not have a clear idea of either material or immaterial substance. It follows from this that if substance exists, we do not know anything about it, apart from its qualities that adhere in it. For example, Locke pointed out that we can sense the hardness, color, and malleability of gold, but that we do not know what it is in gold that gives rise to these qualities. He addressed unextended or non-material substance under the subject of personal identity, asking what it is that makes someone the same person. Locke was concerned that when a person was punished on Judgment Day, that the person being punished was the same person who had committed the crimes he or she was charged with. His answer was that in the context of divine reward or punishment on that great day, you are the same person if you have memories of yourself in the past, so that you know it is the same you who committed the acts for which you are being judged. Locke's refusal to posit a form or substance for the soul seemed to contradict the Trinitarian doctrine of three attributes or natures present in one God. Some of his critics, such as British theologian Edward Stillingfleet, accused Locke of denying the possibility of resurrection in the absence of an incorruptible, immaterial soul substance. Locke's reply to Stillingfleet was to reaffirm his belief in the immortality of the soul as a matter of faith, rather than a fact that could be proved by reason. Stillingfleet believed that some substantial form of a person's body was necessary for there to be a resurrection of that person. Locke's response was to make fun of Stillingfleet by interpreting him to claim that the same body literally had to arise from the grave. Locke wrote, "And I think your lordship will not say that the particles that were separate from the body by perspiration before the point of death were laid up in the grave."
Has there been much progress in philosophy?
Philosophy progresses in two ways. First, philosophical work mirrors the concerns of its historical time. For example, in the 17th century, when modern nations were forming, philosophers like John Locke (1632–1704) and Thomas Hobbes (1588–1679) wrote about the origins of modern, democratic government. In the 20th century, philosophers have applied ethics to new choices made possible by modern medicine. The second form of progress in philosophy consists of the growth of philosophical thought over time. This progression of philosophy is largely a conversation among philosophers, who in one way or another are in dialogue with their historical predecessors, as well as their peers.
What is the British Association of Science?
The purpose of the British Association of Science is to promote sustainability and make science and technology accessible to the public. However, on the organization's website they credit David Brewster, who invented the kaleidoscope in 1815, as its principal founder, not William Whewell. The association now has about 3,000 members, is mainly concerned with the popularization of science, and sponsors a young scientist program that has about 12,000 members. Each year since 1932, the British Association of Science has held a Festival of Science, featuring hundreds of speakers. You can learn more about their current activities at http://www.the-ba.net/the-ba.
How did Gottlob Frege attempt to reduce mathematics to logic?
In his Foundations of Arithmetic, 1884, Frege argued that logic, or the laws of thought, are not descriptive of how we think and that words do not have meaning in isolation but only within context. Then in his two-volume Basic Laws of Arithmetic, 1893 and 1903, Frege began his project in earnest by showing that every predicate determines a class that can be described logically. For example, red is a predicate and red determines a class of red things.
What was the nature of Nietzsche's disability?
Much controversy swirls around this question. There is evidence that he was treated for syphilis at Leipzig, while being kept ignorant of the diagnosis. He is believed to have had tertiary syphilis when he died. It is not clear when Nietzsche might have caught this disease, since he lived an ascetic life. But it was perhaps the result of visiting a brothel only once or twice while he was a student. Nietzsche's health was poor throughout his life. His eyesight was weak and he had gastrointestinal pains that he treated himself by walking and by taking a plethora of pills. In January 1889, Nietzsche broke down in a street in Turin, his arms around a horse that had been beaten. Over the next few days, he wrote demented letters to his friends, claiming to have been crucified by German doctors in a very drawn-out manner, and ordering the Emperor of Germany to report to Rome so that he could be shot. His friends brought him back from Italy, and his mother put him in a clinic in Jena. The treatment was unsuccessful, though, and his mother brought him home. In 1893, his sister, Elizabeth, returned from Paraguay, where her husband had committed suicide. She took charge of the editing and publication of Nietzsche's manuscripts and isolated him from his friends. When their mother died in 1897, Elizabeth brought Nietzsche to Weimar, where she allowed people to see him. Nietzsche was not communicative, but she had him dressed up anyway, so that she could display him. He was by then very famous.
Who was Frederick Douglass?
Many contemporary scholars of race consider Frederick Douglass, born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, 1818 to 1895, to be the first liberatory African American intellectual. In 1873, he was the vice presidential candidate when Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for U.S. president. Douglass began life as a slave, but was taught to read at the age of 12 by his owner's sister-in-law. He taught other slaves to read, and after a series of failed escapes he finally gained his freedom and became active in the Massachusetts anti-slavery movement. At 23 he began his distinguished and inspiring career of public speaking. He was present at the Seneca Falls Convention, where the American suffragist movement originated in 1848. Douglass toured Ireland and England in the mid-1840s, and his supporters raised money to legally purchase his freedom in 1856. Back in the United States, Douglass published newspapers, the most famous of which was the North Star, which had as the motto "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." In the 1850s, Douglass spoke for school desegregation in New York. During the U.S. Civil War, he promoted the rights of blacks to fight for the Union. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1862, he said, "We were waiting and listening as for a bolt from the sky, we were watching, by the dim light of the stars for the dawn of a new day, we were longing for the answer to the agonizing prayers of centuries." In 1884, after his first wife had died, Douglass married Helen Pitts, a white suffragist from New York. Pitts had worked on Alpha, the 19th-century radical women's publication. While living in Washington, D.C., Douglass' main writings are a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, An American Slave, 1845, The Heroic Slave, Autographs for Freedom, 1853. My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881, revised, 1892. He edited the North Star from 1847 to 1851, after which it became the Frederick Douglass paper.